countryside of Ukraine is getting ready for the Russian army's demise. The assault plans of Kiev cost Russia almost 200,000 men. Russian soldiers no longer desire to engage in combat in Ukraine as a result. Other factors that influence Russian troops' hesitation to combat in Ukraine include instances like internal rioting, communication problems, and poor-living circumstances inside Vladimir Putin's army. Russian army men are deserting and rebelling against their leadership on many front lines in Ukrainian territory. Such an uprising was last seen in Russia during the Soviet period. However, the Russian army is currently in a considerably worse state than it was during World War II due to socio-psychological causes, an economic impasse, and a loss of morale and motivation. Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, appears to be unconcerned with the advancements and successes made by the Ukrainian army on the front lines. Putin also doesn't care how his own army is doing. Putin continues to employ his forces for retribution preparations even as the Ukrainian armed forces free one by one the seized regions along crucial front lines, including Zaporizhia, the Dnipro, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. The Russian forces were practically detached from the conflict in recent days, especially when the Ukrainians freed 9 communities in Zaporizhia. The Russian troops' uprising has some very valid justifications. The Russians are plagued by a scarcity of supplies and ammunition in Zaporizhia. The Russian army is unable to provide Zaporizhia with soldier reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies. Since the Ukrainians have taken over this area along the Dnipro-Kherson front line. On the other side, the Russian soldiers in this area are rising up in rebellion against Putin and the Kremlin, who abandoned them to perish in this conflict. Recent events in Zaporizhia saw the raising of rebel flags and the voicing of Russian servicemen. About hundreds of Dagestani troops from the Caspian Fleet declined to take part in the fighting in the Doroshenko area of the Zaporizhia province. He disarmed hundreds of units that stood down from combat. This demonstrated that the Russian army no longer maintained a balance between order and command. The uprising of ethnic troops fighting for the Russian army is a very strong response to Vladimir Putin, especially in Zaporizhia, where the offensive operations of the Ukrainian army are advancing smoothly during this crucial period when Putin is seeking for men willing to fight for the Russian army. Even one Russian soldier rebelling has a snowball effect. The process of rebellion reaches a huge scale as a result of the Russian troops' support of their fellow rebels. According to Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine, Hanna Maliar, the inexperience of the Russian army is contributing to Moscow's daily soldier losses. Additionally, Russian soldiers don't always disclose to the highest authorities that they lost the areas they previously seized in Ukraine because they are terrified of their superiors. According to Alexei Reznikov, the defense minister of Ukraine. So only in the Zaporizhia area did the Russian army raise the rebel flags. Of course, the brutal Ukrainian attacks in Zaporizhia led to an upsurge in incidents of mutiny inside the Russian army. However, the Russians also instigated uprisings in the Donetsk region. In addition to this one, if you recall, Hanna Maliar, the Deputy Minister of Defense for Ukraine, said that her soldiers had taken the initiative in Bakhmut. The assault actions of the Ukrainians in Bakhmut almost doubled after these critical declarations. The Russians found themselves in a hopeless situation in Bakhmut as a result of the Wagner Group's mercenaries leaving the city to change the situation in Bakhmut. Ramzan Kadyrov's soldiers are also insufficient. So in Bakhmut, the Ukrainians are still blowing like a hurricane. The Russian army is negatively affected by this wind. Russian soldiers refuse to engage in combat in Bakhmut anymore because they are no longer able to endure the Ukrainian forces' wind. To protect their lives, the Russians started to retreat from the front lines. On the other side, a few Russian soldiers in Bakhmut gave up and turned themselves in to the Ukrainians. As a result, when the Ukrainian armed forces strike them at Bakhmut, the Russians declined to engage in combat. Maxim Zorin, a former commander of the Azov, complained of the disarray and lack of leadership among the Russian forces close to Bakhmut. The former regimental commander claims that there are becoming more instances of revolt among the Russian army personnel stationed in the Bakhmut direction. According to Zorin, there hasn't been a large flight or surrender of Russian forces in the direction of Bakhmut at this moment because the rebelling Russian soldiers are still few in number. However, it is inevitable that Russian forces on Bakhmut and other front lines in the Donetsk region will begin a large departure and defection. Putin's army have already started to depart from Verkhovka, Kleshchev, Kurdyumov, and Ossinovka. It appears that the Russians will withdraw from the front lines surrounding the city, including Bakhmut. If the offensive operations of the Ukrainian soldiers on these front lines continue to be effective, new information is still coming out of Klishchiivka. According to Ukrainian mill bloggers, the Ukrainian assaults on Kazivka were mainly successful, leading to an advance and the acquisition of many trench line positions along a crucial channel. It is anticipated that the Russian army would lose heart at this point and hand over their weaponry to the Ukrainian army. What type of impacts would the rise in instances of Russian insurrection on the battlefield and the Ukrainians' effective offensive operations have on Kiev? Of course, Ukrainians need military assistance to take advantage of the unprecedented casualties suffered by the Russian army because no army has access to endless amounts of military munitions in addition to more military supplies. Ukraine also needs diplomatic and political assistance. Usually NATO is involved in this. Since the start of the battle, members of the global military alliance have supported Kiev. These EU members continue to help the Ukrainian army financially and militarily. Additionally, the NATO alliance defends Kiev in the context of world politics. Jens Stoltenberg, the newly appointed Secretary General of NATO, emphasized that Ukraine's sovereignty must be upheld, including the country's F-16 fighter training program. Ben Wallace, the Defense Secretary for the United Kingdom, advocated that NATO should ignore certain conditions for Ukraine's membership. The U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, asserts that each NATO member should take stock of their current situation. Additionally, according to Julianne Smith, they are working on a deal that goes beyond simply restating Bucharest, which has not specified a time frame for Ukraine's membership. The Ukrainian army continues to get financial and military help in addition to political backing for Kiev. An extra $890 million tranche has been approved by the IMF for budget support for Ukraine. This sum is a portion of the $155 billion total package. But the release of cash is contingent on how well Ukraine is doing with its reforms, which include macroeconomic stability. On the other side, Ukraine just received a $1.5 billion loan from the World Bank. The West and the USA have contributed to Ukraine's regeneration in part. In a statement on the matter, the Ukrainian Ministry of Health stated that since the commencement of the extensive invasion of Russia, 1,376 health institutions throughout Ukraine have been damaged and 184 additional facilities have been entirely destroyed. The Kharkiv, Kherson, Donetsk, Mykolaiv, and Kiev areas sustained the largest damage to their medical infrastructure. The Ukrainian ministry did point out that as of the end of June 2023, 357 facilities have been partially rehabilitated, while 333 can be fully restored. In other words, Ukraine requires a lot more assistance for its repair projects. Another military assistance shipment from Germany to Ukraine contained an air surveillance radar station. 16 Zetros all-terrain trucks, 3 Biber armored bridge-laying vehicles, a mobile mine-clearing system, 2 border guard vehicles, and 3 Biber armored bridge-laying vehicles. The Russian occupation policies, in the opinion of the Ukrainian army's partners, are incorrect, and this conflict has to end immediately. He keeps stating in the foreign media that everyone opposes this conflict, including the Ukrainian sportsmen as well as Kiev's friends. President Thomas Bach argued with 2 Ukrainian athletes about Russia's participation in the 2024 Paris Games at his offices in Switzerland. Victoria Tkachuk and Anna Ryzhkova, who competed in the 400-meter hurdles at the Olympics, should be prohibited from entering Russia, according to him, since they support their nation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Bach has previously maintained that prejudice would occur if Russians and Belarusians were excluded only because of the nationality on their passports. But at this point in the conflict, the Ukrainians are not hesitant to indiscriminately destroy all Russian soldiers and military targets on the front lines. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and other members of the Kremlin administration are predicted to hoist the white flag at this point. The Ukrainian troops are launching strikes right now in an effort to take one of the front line's most important strategic location. The region around the Mokryagyi-Only River and the Vremyevsky outcrop was one of the most remarkable locations where fights between Zaporizhia and Donetsk were getting more intense. Ukrainian soldiers have been attempting to take control of this region for a week, despite the fact that it is a natural defense line. We can see that efforts are being made to free towns like Blagodany, Niskichny, Storojev, and Makarovka. As of right now, both banks of the Morily River are being invaded by Ukrainian soldiers as they move towards Staro-Malinivka. This community may be referred to as a key border and a transportation hub in this area. Staro-Malinivka's release largely clears the way to Mariupol. Another crucial element is that the so-called support belt of the Russian invaders runs from Velikonovo-Selivka to Staro-Malinivka. And this development represents a turning point in this specific field. The offensive strategy that the Ukrainian troops have been employing since the start of the week has been successful in this direction. On the cliff, Ukrainian paratroopers bravely fought to capture the front and succeeded. Additionally, the Ukrainian military started using fresh units drawn from the Army Reserve. On June 13th, he was spotted close to the Niskichny settlement, which is part of the 25th Airborne Brigades from Nevsky Ledge. This indicates that this unit will now be a part of the Ukrainian Armed Forces expanding forces that are marching south from Velikonovo-Silka along the Mokryagyi River. Your brigade proceeded south and joined the Ukrainian onslaught. This indicates that Kiev is beginning to dispatch more troops to its southern onslaught. The goal of Kievan troops is to weaken the Russian defense and take advantage of it. It could be necessary to use the dexterous Ukrainian brigades to seize this area of the front, reporting to their bases about the worrying state of the front in the Zaporozhian direction is tough for Russian military propagandists. A significant portion of the front line has been completely taken over by Ukrainian army forces. According to military informant, one of the most popular Russian military telegram channels, the Kiev government was able to entirely seize control of the Nevsky Ledge with this triumph. Russian sources have reported that the invading forces are moving away from the front line of resistance. Numerous communities have been evacuated, but withdrawals are still happening throughout the whole line. In addition, Russian sources claim that Rovno status is not favorable for Russia. Also soon required is the withdrawal of Russian armed forces from this region. The operation will soon be joined by more better-equipped and coordinated Ukrainian troops. According to reports from the area, it is anticipated that the Kiev troops would accomplish far larger triumphs as a result of their participations. An essential goal of Ukraine's offensive against the line at Zaporizhia was the Ukrainian troops intended to use this operation to drive the Russians across Tokhmak and into Melitopol and ultimately the Azov coast. The Russian occupying force will be cut in half as a result. However, this strategy had a major flaw. The Russians were aware of the price losing Melitopol would exact on them. For this reason, the Kremlin spent more than 6 months constructing a sophisticated network of defensive belts on its side of the front line, which spans 1,000 kilometers between Zaporizhia and Melitopol. The first 4 days of the attack made clear the caliber of this endeavor. But then, does Ukraine have planned in response to this defensive line? What method of assault is he employed? I would like to remind you once more before we continue our video, leave a thumbs up and leave comments. Click the super thanks button underneath our video. Ukraine is still using small units of tanks, personnel carriers for tactical engagements. Russians may concentrate on a small number at a time in this fashion. It can utilize its artillery, aviation, and ground capabilities efficiently. Ukraine's soldiers have been dispersed over too many potential points of attack on an operational level. Attacks have occurred in the Orikhiv area, Minkrij, Bavdiivka, Bakhmut, and Kupiansk directions since June 5th. If you wish to assist my team and I in our efforts while opposing the invasion of Ukraine, spreading your forces thinly over too many axes of progress is the same error that led to the first invasion of Russia in 2022. Having very little influence over any of the tech firms have so far been distributed across too many fronts, leaving little fighting strength at a crucial moment. Ukraine must concentrate its forces in a strategic location if it is to prevail. At the same time, this must not have had a substantial defensive capacity at this stage. It is still too early to judge Kiev's actions in the Donbass and southern Ukraine in terms of the ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive. But you should know that the Ukrainians continue to demonstrate their heroism and tenacity in their efforts to reclaim their land. There is a psychological component to these assaults as well. This is a really challenging battle. This argument is going to last a long time since it is so intense for the Russians as well. This position appears to be quite challenging. Russian military have lost tens of thousands of men since the beginning of this month. There were hundreds of captured soldiers. Numerous heavy weapons systems were lost. It has been less than 2 weeks since the Ukrainian counteroffensive began. During this time, the Russian army lost roughly 8,000 troops. That translates to 600 soldiers on average every day. The situation for the Ukrainian military, however, does not appear to be very promising. When trying to breach Russian fortifications, Ukrainian forces and armored vehicles incur severe losses. As a result, it must utilize soldiers to launch an attack. As a consequence, Russian snipers and machine gunners can see Ukrainian forces moving forward with infantry. Ukrainian military continue to suffer severe losses as a result of this circumstance. What may be in store for Ukraine as a result of the strikes that started on June 5th? Can we discuss a significant triumph or a painful defeat if the Ukrainian president instructs his soldiers to apply pressure indefinitely? They could finally breach Russia's defense lines. The main defense zone, however, is likely to receive the most of Russia's artillery. As a result, the Ukrainian units that will advance from behind might sustain even greater losses. When Ukraine's offensive strike capability reaches its peak, they will be at risk of a significant Russian counterattack. This appears to be the foundation of Russian military theory. Attack when the opposition is sufficiently vulnerable. Additionally, it doesn't appear probable that Zelensky will be extended a NATO invitation or even the guarantee of a brand new large-scale tank aircraft or ammunition in the near future. Ukraine could attempt to retake territory occupied by Russia. He can launch a huge new offensive in the Kherson area to accomplish this. He can currently retain the intensity of his attacks along the remaining contact line at low to moderate levels. More significantly, Ukraine now realizes that executing combined armed operations against a strong enemy defense is the trickiest tactic in conventional warfare. Many analysts predicted that Ukraine would assault Russia in the manner of D-Day. Kiev appears to be thinking about something else, though. Let's look at the current situation and the specifics of Ukraine's anticipated defense. Ukrainian officials launched a deliberate offensive last week to dismantle Russian gun installations near the front lines of battle. According to Ukrainian military authorities, they started taking aim at howitzers, mortars, and rocket launchers under Kremlin control. The data provided by the Ukrainian General Staff indicates that the plans appear to be carried out since 40 Russian howitzers were destroyed this week by effective Ukrainian strikes. The gathered information demonstrates that the Russian army's artillery loss rates were at their greatest point during hostilities. According to Ukrainian and NATO military doctrine, highly trained special forces teams must operate clandestinely prior to a significant ground assault. These troops must conduct patrols behind enemy lines to acquire intelligence, identify weakly fortified regions, and conduct hit-and-run operations on vulnerable areas. So as the Ukrainian army putting these words into practice, the Ukrainian military today engages in pre-attack special operations training that closely resembles what is described in textbooks. 80 to 100 soldiers who were driving armored Max Pro mine-protected trucks built in the U.S. earlier this week fled northern Ukraine. It entered the Belgorod Oblast of Russia and started firing on a border post. At least 3 Russian army armored vehicles were taken by Ukrainian military after 2 days of gunfights and mortar fire with the local troops. At a news conference, a militia comprised of Russian nationalists claimed responsibility for the assaults, while Russian authorities and military bloggers alleged that this was a raid intended to divert Russia's defenses from the planned large Ukrainian onslaught in the south. Kiev officially denied any involvement on their side of the conflict. Ukrainian small boat raiders carried out unexpected raids in the Kherson area at the opposite end of the 500-kilometer front. They frequently traversed the Dnipro River Delta, freeing nearby communities and attacking Russian military targets with missiles. Potemkin Island in the Dnipro River was fully taken by the Ukrainian defenders, according to local intelligence. Furthermore, this island may first day serve as a base for Ukrainian assaults on Crimea via bridges erected across the river. Many areas of the country are swampy, forested, and have inadequate road systems for tiny formations of Ukrainian troops. The terrain is ideal. The classic Russian defense system, however, requires dry terrain to support tanks and artillery. Thus, it is not appropriate. The 73rd Naval Special Operations Center personnel were in charge of the operations on Pro, according to a report from the Ukrainian General Staff. This material also serves as evidence that the Ukrainian army's anticipated counter-offensive has started. The Russian army had grown tired of the Ukrainian forces roving the left bank of the Dnipro until mid-May. Attacks with pricey cruise missiles were undertaken by the Russian High Command against a few Potemkin Island structures. But the effects of these strikes for Russia were ineffective. The predicted Ukrainian counter-offensive has thus begun. Right. The latest to explicitly state that Kiev's counter-offensive has already started was senior advisor to the Ukrainian president, Mikhailo Podolyak. The Russian frontline lines may not yet be directly under attack, and the Ukrainian tanks may not yet be moving. But there is already a concerted effort to undermine the Russian defense. This is not a single ceremony that will start with a sad red ribbon cutting at a specific hour. These are only a few of the several diverse steps that have been taken, are being taken, and will be done tomorrow to defeat Russian forces in various ways. A counterattack is also being launched by massively destroying the Russian army's supplies. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Agency has declared that Ukraine already possesses the bare minimum of weaponry required to start a retaliation. Last month, Ukrainian intelligence reaffirmed the attack's intended springtime timing, which had been foretold by winter. The attack would need the heavy weapons that were on their way at the time. Ukrainian intelligence stated more recently, in order to be highly effective. When will the weapons that are on their way to Ukraine arrive? 2 shipments of weapons, one each from Sweden and Germany, have not yet arrived. However, other sources state the delivery of the weapons will occur in the next weeks. German officials have said that Germany delivered 110 Leopard 1 tanks to Ukraine. Additionally, the crew training for Ukrainian soldiers in Germany is almost finished. The Leopard 1, a combat vehicle from the Cold War with a capable main gun and superior optics, but with less armor than most current tanks, closes a significant hole in the offensive capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces. The protection of Ukrainian forces against Russian weaponry would be somewhat high if they had a dependable tank that could destroy Russian infantry. It has taken a while for the International Tank Alliance, which supports Ukraine, to deliver Ukrainian tanks in the first few weeks of June. A whole battalion of 40 Leopard 1 tanks. The first batch will arrive in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian army will then give the order to start their mainland attack. A whole Ukrainian combat brigade's worth of tanks, artillery, and infantry fighting vehicles have now been sent, according to official declarations from Stockholm. 100 Swedish military vehicles, including the CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle and the Ukrainian force using the Archer semi-automatic howitzer, will probably be the finest armored brigade on the front when the unit, which will be armed with Swedish weaponry, will start. Its training procedure is unknown. However, the counterattack, schedules, and plans have already been updated by the Ukrainian military command to include the arrival of Swedish weaponry. So does Russia have any safety measures in place? The Russian military discovered the risk of placing heavy weaponry on the front lines the hard way, starting with the introduction of the US-made precision-guided HIMARS missile launchers in late May 2022. A GPS-guided US missile will strike the target once Ukrainian military intelligence eventually finds these weapons or air defense radars. However, there are also more and more signs that the Russian military is either preparing its own significant operations or is anticipating significant Ukrainian attacks. Russian soldiers and equipment are reportedly heading towards regions where, in Moscow's assessment, a Ukrainian ground attack would be launched, according to both official Ukrainian and military sources. Daily scenario estimates from sources like the Ukrainian Armed Forces and Russian military authorities indicate that the most concentrated on their route to a prospective attack on the Ukrainian city of Melitopol. Troops are moving through the eastern Kherson and Zaporizhia area. The Russian High Command reportedly withdrew forces from the Donbass, eastern Kharkiv, and northeastern Ukraine to the south in order to erect several layers of defense. According to the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs, which has regularly released unique and comprehensive military intelligence since the start of the conflict, heavy Russian artillery has reportedly left its positions surrounding the Donbass cities of Starobelsk, Luhansk, and Krasnodar, according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs. Additionally, Russian armaments were removed from Kherson and Zaporizhia in the south. Other sources claim that Russian artillery bombardment targeted Ukrainian frontline defenses in the south, notably those on the right bank of the Dnipro, between the towns of Stanislav and Berislav. another possible Ukrainian river crossing point. All of the public reports and assertions demonstrate that although being unofficial, the Ukrainian counter-offensive has started. The Ukrainian counterattack will be considered to have begun once a large number of contemporary weapons that are now on their way join the arsenal of the Ukrainian army. The conflict in Ukraine is poised to take an irreversible turn. The Ukrainian battle became more intense as the winter months came to a conclusion. The fighting between the two forces has primarily occurred on the Eastern Front in recent months, but last week's events on the Southern Front caused the Ukrainian conflict to intensify on both the Southern and Eastern fronts. On the Southern Front, the Ukrainian army has had great success recently. Once again, the army's triumph demonstrated to everyone how the correct intelligence and a sound plan might alter the direction of the conflict. Let's discuss and assess what occurred on the Southern Front, as well as any potential repercussions. In the region of Zaporizhia that was taken, one of the Russian soldiers' defensive lines continuously spans more than 70 kilometers. The Russian army's fortified region was found using Sentinel-2. Satellite imagery on the boundaries of the settlement of Semenivka are the endpoints of the Russian fortified region in the west. That Sentinel-2 satellite photos have identified. The distance to Melitopol Administrative Center, which is governed by the Russian Federation, is roughly 9 kilometers. The easternmost point of these places lies in the fields next to Marinivka, a settlement in the Primorsky area. Satellite data analysis reveals that this defensive line's construction started in early September 2022. By October 18th, the megaditch was complete after Russian forces started digging a trench simultaneously from two directions. It is 70 kilometers long in its entirety. According to the authorities, this is about comparable to the distance from Kherson to Mykolaiv or from Vienna to Bratislava and makes up over 1/3 of the length of the Zaporizhia area from east to west. The Ukrainian army immediately intervened after learning about the Russian army's line of defense. The Ukrainian army started an offensive assault against these locations the morning before using a highly effective plan that was developed using the application, photographs and analysis of the reports from the area. The operation allowed the Ukrainian forces to advance by around 10 kilometers from the Russian position, able to secure the component. 350 Russian soldiers were reported dead during the operation, while 200 Russian soldiers were reported injured, according to the first figures. According to the Chief of Staff of Ukraine, the precise numbers on Russian casualties will be released in a few days because the data are not yet clear for the next Ukrainian invasion. This action of the Ukrainian army is crucial for the attack to be successfully completed. Melitopol must be liberated from Russian rule since the offensive operations of Ukraine will commence from two branches, one of which will be aimed straight towards Crimea. So is the Ukrainian army's endgame in sight. It goes without saying that Crimea is Ukraine's ultimate goal. The liberation of Crimea is crucial for Ukraine. As President Zelensky has underlined repeatedly since the start of the conflict, it would be accurate to say that following the most recent operations, the Ukrainian army moved closer to Crimea. Russian officials have issued a warning that Crimea, which is now under Russian control, might be targeted by Ukraine as part of the continuing conflict. Unnamed officials from the Kremlin stated that Ukrainian forces would launch missile assaults against Russian ships and infrastructure. The officials' remarks came as Russia entered its 409th day of its conflict with Ukraine, which was initially referred to by Russian President Vladimir Putin as a special military operation and saw the United States and its Western allies provide significant financial support to the Ukrainian government. The official issued a warning about potential strikes by the Ukrainian military on infrastructure located on the peninsula. they will undoubtedly be a top priority. In addition to all other communications used to convey supplies, Black Sea Fleet ships are stationed at the Crimean Bridge, airport network checkpoints, roadsides, and mooring places to attack these crucial sites. The Ukrainian side will employ all of its soldiers and resources. There will undoubtedly be usage of Ukrainian missile systems and other equipment that can attack these objectives. The Crimean Peninsula is a top priority for Russia. Thus, in this situation, the Russian army needs to be meticulously prepared to withstand any invasions by the Ukrainian army. The fall of Crimea implies that the Ukrainians will win the war. Given all of the Russian army's present supply routes go through there, even while Russia fortifies its defenses in Crimea and forbids Ukrainian strikes, it is well known that the Russian air defense there is surprisingly inadequate against Ukrainian assaults. The official from Kremlin statements provide light on how the Ukrainian counter-offensive in Crimea may develop. According to the official statements, it is plausible to assume that the Kremlin has considered and maybe made arrangements for a potential Ukrainian strike. What makes Crimea so valuable then? The Crimean Peninsula was technically seized by Russia in 2014, but the Ukrainian government has never acknowledged this annexation. Additionally, the vast majority of US and international countries rejected Russian claims in the area, following cautions in May of last year that the situation with Russian soldiers would undoubtedly become worse. Several experts claim to have altered their opinions, condemning Ukrainian forces and pointing out the fallacy of assertions that Kiev forces had made significant victory and were prepared to launch a counterattack. Experts caution Russia to get ready in case Ukraine decides to purchase combat planes from NATO, a contrast to Ukraine's prior request for US-made F-16 fighter planes. NATO allies Poland and Slovakia last month declared that they would be deploying fighter jets to Ukraine. The Biden administration has declined to give the planes to Ukraine, citing challenges with pilot upkeep and training. What then is Russia doing in Crimea in preparation for a potential Ukrainian attack? In light of reports that Ukraine's Western allies are beginning to warm to retaking Crimea after almost 10 years of Russian domination, the Russian military is allegedly bolstering Crimea's fortifications. According to the Ukrainian Armed Forces Main Information Directorate, military information in the area indicated that the forces on the peninsula were continually prepared for battle while Russian soldiers could be observed digging in certain areas. The Ukrainian Main Intelligence Directorate regularly keeps an eye on everything pertaining to the military unit's operations in the temporarily Russian-controlled Crimea on the peninsula's territory. They are getting ready for defensive operations and the infrastructure is maintained in a combat-ready state. These facilities are strong land and aviation systems that are situated on Crimean soil. On the Crimean Peninsula, Russia is thought to have 60 combat helicopters and 90 other aircraft. Officials who looked at satellite images that showed Russian military continuing to construct defensive structures in southern Ukraine near the border with Crimea echoed many of these statements. Additionally, satellite photographs reveal that during the past few months, Russian military have expanded the number of trenches and barricades along the routes leading to the seized Crimea in Kherson Oblast. The accusations coincided with assertions by Ukrainian authorities that Western friends of Ukraine are warming to the notion of going beyond Russian President Vladimir Putin's line and retaking Crimea, a peninsula that is now in conflict with Ukraine. Some who think Russia has the capability to launch an offensive war in Ukraine feel that Ukraine's attempt to reclaim the peninsula won't cause the same issues. According to warnings from Western officials, if Ukraine invades Crimea again, there would inevitably escalate the situation to the point where a nuclear exchange is possible. Since it became increasingly obvious what Crimea is, what it means for Russia, and how things are interrelated around Crimea, the discourse has changed. Similar to the referendums that were previously held in the Crimean areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson of the Ukraine, the conflict resulted in their annexation by Moscow. These referendums were roundly denounced as being fraudulent by the United States and European nations in the international community. Since that time, Russia has relocated to the Dnipro River's left bank, abandoning the Kherson region's administrative headquarters, although it still controls the straight land route to the Crimea. Due to its water resources, Kherson, which is situated in the north of the Crimean Peninsula, is very significant for Crimea, which had water problems when it was seized. In the meanwhile, Russian forces control around 70% of the Zaporizhia area, where there is still a lot of fighting, including the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. In order to preserve its road connection with Crimea through the Donbas area, Russia must keep both the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. Therefore, before commencing the Crimean attack, the Ukrainian army must eliminate the Russian presence in these areas and pave the way to Crimea.